I wanted to kick off just by acknowledging what crazy times we live in, understanding that people are extraordinarily busy, and also experiencing really, I think, quite exceptional levels of stress and grief and trauma at the moment, whether that's related to geopolitics and the changing shape of aid, or to the horrific and unconscionable conflicts happening again this week in Gaza, but ongoing in DRC and in Sudan and in many other places around the world, including places where many of you are. To start, as usual, with an expression of the solidarity of the Pledge family, the Pledge community, to everyone who's affected by the failures of the international system at the moment, and to really appreciate your time and energy in showing up for this session. We think, and I suspect that you think, and that's why you're here, that our collective energy and our collaboration is more important now than it's ever been before. So we've put together, as you know, a new series for the Pledge for Change, of a new series of gatherings that were requested by our working groups. This one originated in our Equitable Partnerships working group, to showcase and share learning from across the Pledge community. And so that agenda is still being developed. There will be opportunities for each of you to feed into it. But at the moment, our objectives together are to foster collaborative learning and practice and knowledge exchange that should be accessible to all of our signatories and their partners and the Pledge supporters. To provide a learning process with regular interactions, with peer exchanges and facilitated discussions, which will create space for critical reflections on trends, challenges and emerging opportunities, with the intent to shift power in the wider ecosystem. And ultimately to document promising practices and share existing resources within the Pledge community and colleagues in other allied networks and movements, because we all know there's a lot of great practice going on. And one of the challenges we have is joining up across our diverse and sometimes quite complex ecosystem. And I'm so pleased and honoured that today we've got Dylan Matthews, the Chief Executive of Peace Direct, who's agreed to come in and share insights from Peace Direct and facilitate a discussion about transforming partnerships. Peace Direct have been a supporter of the Pledge for a few months, and have been a long-standing convener, coordinator, leader and navigator of the spaces between civil society and international parts of the system. And so we're really pleased and grateful, Dylan, that you've agreed not only to do this session, but also another one in April. But today we're going to be looking at the findings and recommendations from Peace Direct's Transforming Partnerships in International Cooperation report. I'm not going to say more about that because I want Dylan to talk before his power goes off, hopefully. But the plan is for Dylan to share a presentation with us for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions. So please note down your questions. Feel free to drop those in the chat as we go if you want to, or be ready to come in. And we hope that we can make this a good interactive conversation with the people on the call. Thank you, Dylan.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for the invitation. I think, as you mentioned, these are really, really hard times for us all, whether we're the Global North allies, whether we're the Global South activists, community leaders, local organizations, whoever you might be. The assault on civil society is pretty extreme. The funding cuts, the attacks on progressive causes, So I just wanted to recognize that too, and to say, these conversations aren't easy at the best of times, and these aren't the best of times. So, whilst recognizing the challenges that we're all facing, and these are crises that we're facing, the multiple crises. I want us, and I certainly at Peace Direct, we're still trying to think, how can we still, in our own small way, advance the transformation of the sector that we're looking for? And that's what the pledge is here for as well. So, you know, there is a risk with every crisis that it distracts us and then forces us to sort of look at inwards and protect our funding, protect the status quo, because things are being dismantled. But actually, we do hope that this is, however painful it is, that we can also find a way of navigating through this to a system that works for everyone better. So with that in mind, I hope that we enter into that spirit as we discuss partnerships, which I know so many of you are already discussing at length. So I'm going to share my screen now. As I mentioned to Kate, I do have builders on either side of my house working, so they've cut the power and making all manner of noises. So apologies if you hear some background noise. Um, so let's see. Right. Um, Can I just check that you can see my slides?
Yes, we can.
You can see. Great. So, as Kate mentioned, I'm going to speak a little bit about some work that we've been doing, consultations that we've been having with activists around the world around partnerships, and that then formed the basis of a report that we produced called Transforming Partnerships in International Cooperation. Some of you may have seen some of these slides before, so apologies if this is deja vu for you. Just a little bit about Peace Direct if you don't know us. So we are a UK-based INGO, founded just over 20 years ago to support and amplify the voices of local peace builders. So we are a peace building organization. But we're trying to shift power and resources in the system towards locally led efforts. So we've been focused on locally led peace building efforts, but in trying to look at what we need to do to support local peace builders, we started about 10 years ago to look at the broader system of international cooperation. So what is it? What are the dysfunctions in the wider system of international cooperation that mean that not only local peace builders, but local actors, local activists, local community groups, local NGOs don't get the support and the recognition they need? So over those years, and there's much more we can say here, but over those years, as we've been looking at the system and as we've been analysing the role of INGOs, we've observed three main issues, three main problems that a lot of INGOs suffer from. One is that up until very, very recently, they have been very slow to acknowledge the problems of structural racism and their own neo-colonial attitudes. So these attitudes that we have held in the global north that say that we know best, we are the experts, others don't have that expertise. And that has been underpinning the growth of the INGO sector for the last 75 years or more. So that's the first problem. The second is that I think, and this is very poorly understood, I think, in the sector still, is that INGOs, in trying to grow their role and their reach, they've actually suppressed the growth of Indigenous civil society. So we've always known that INGOs have wanted to do good and have wanted to help, and they talk about that in their strategies about growth, extending the footprint, doing more work, helping more people, and no doubt they've helped many more people. But what we have also recognized is that in doing that, in growing their footprint, they have competed with local organizations, taken up a disproportionate amount of the funding, and therefore suppressed the growth of Indigenous civil society. And to give you a stark figure that some of you may know, a report that was published by the Global Fund for Community Foundations and the Shift the Power Network showed that 93% of all the funding for civil society organizations worldwide that came from OECD DAC members went to INGOs and not to local organizations. So civil society funding from the OECD, 93% of it goes to INGOs, most of whom come from those OECD countries. So there's a problem in how INGO sector has grown. And the third area is that the INGs have struggled to imagine or reimagine a role for themselves that doesn't involve direct implementation or grant management. So for decades, we've talked about INGs doing the thing. Now we're starting to see some shift towards being grant managers and working in partnership. But actually, you know, there are other roles that we could play, and there's a bit of a failure of imagination, which I will be talking about, by the way, in my next learning session for the pledge around the roles that INGOs can play. But what we've noticed is that if you take those three things together, those problems, those challenges are core to the reason why equitable partnerships with local organizations or organizations in the global south have been almost impossible to achieve. This idea of equitable partnerships feels very distant, very remote, because of these problems that we still have in our sector. So what have we done? Well, over the last 5 years, we've been holding online conversations and consultations. We're an activist organisation, so we provide direct support to local organisations around the world, but we also have a research arm and a convening arm where we bring together local activists online and in person to ask the question, what are the problems in the sector? So we've done that. We started during COVID in 2020 online. And actually, it's probably closer to 1,000 local organisations having been involved in those. We've asked similar questions in some of these consultations around how local actors see us. How do they experience us in their spaces? How do they understand the issues of power imbalances or structural racism or systemic racism? We've talked about the different roles that people play in the sector, but also the language and terminology that we use, as well as some of the new language around sort of decolonizing or localization, for example. Most importantly, in each of the consultations that we've held, we've always asked and invited local actors to come up with, dream the sort of manifesto. What are the ideas that they have for changing the system? And that's given us incredibly rich insights into what needs to change. And those are the three reports that you see in front of you, are three of a number of, we have produced others, reports that help kind of guide us into where we should be going. Now, I'd encourage you to have a look at all of them. They're not our recommendations. They're recommendations that were crowdsourced by some incredibly passionate activists and sort of NGO and community leaders. So what we're going to talk about is the partnerships one. So the partnerships consultation took place in 2023, and we published the report the same year. And we've been really trying to socialize the findings because, as I say, they're some really useful findings, we think, and I hope you find them too. So we're going to start just by talking about where did partnerships go wrong? And we asked that was the first question we asked in this consultation. These consultations tend to last about 3 days. And we just have some fairly broad brush kind of questions that we ask. And this is the first one. What is the problem with current partnerships? So how can we understand the situation as it is right now, as it is experienced by local actors, so that we can then figure out how to build from there? And there were 4 main reasons that they gave for where partnerships have gone wrong. I thought these were really simple, but I think for some reason they seem quite difficult for us to grasp. The first is a problem of definition. So we heard time and time again that we at Global North actors just don't define what we mean by partnership. And I was quite struck by that. I looked back at our own partnership agreements and our own sort of partnerships over the years, and we don't define what partnership means precisely. And that lack of definition gives a sense to Global South actors that actually we don't really mean a genuine or equitable partnership. What we want is a subcontracting relationship. So this sort of ambiguity that we have about not defining partnership, maybe we've assumed that we all share the same understanding of what a partner is or what partnership is. And as one of the participants said, it's one of the most misused concepts in international development, because actually partnerships are really not built on equality, but rather inequality. So there's a problem of definition that we've got to just revisit. What do we mean by partnership? The second reason that they said the partnerships are failing is because they are transactional. That follows from the definition. If we don't precisely define what partnerships are, people think of them tend to think of them as transactional relationships. And actually, I think lots of INGOs do want transactional relationships. They don't want deep, meaningful, equitable partnerships, but they want transactional relationships. I give you money, you do this thing, you do these outputs, and then you report to us and we report to the donor. Sometimes it's worse than that. It's you implement something that we have decided is a good idea to do. So, as this one participant said, most organizations deal with inputs and outputs. It's about the results rather than the journey. And most local actors want to focus on the journey. So it's the transformation that we go on together. And that's what they say does not happen right now. It feels very, very much like a sort of commercial relationship. The third reason was, and I talked about this in my first slide, neocolonialism. There's still this problem of attitudes that global North actors have, which is that we have the expertise, we know the answers, that we have something invaluable to give. So one of the participants mentioned that, we still, us internationals, us global North actors, still assume that we can bring something useful to the table. Maybe we don't actually. Sometimes, we're not as useful as we think we are. So that we've got to really focus on unpicking and unpacking some of those attitudes, which are in our first report, Time to Decolonize Aid, which I won't be talking about today. And then the third one was about power. So they said actually one of the reasons why partnerships haven't worked is because we really don't talk about the power in the relationship. And the sort of conditions that come with the power imbalances between, the global North partner and the global South partner. We were really fascinated by this concept and this idea of the power being this hidden dimension in partnerships that we just don't talk about. And I'll be honest with you, I think, I've been chief executive at Peace Direct for 10 years. I'm not sure we do a good enough job of talking about power and how we show up in places and how we wield it to our partners. So we asked as a supplementary question, well, what is the problem then? Let's dig a little deeper to understand what the problem is when it comes to power. And why global North organizations have been reluctant. So what is this barrier that's stopping us from having this open conversation about power? And there were four reasons, again, four main reasons that came up in the consultation. The first is the maintenance of power. It's quite clear from the consultation, at least, that global South actors believe that we want to hold on to power. We in the global North are keen to hold on to power. We maintain our privileged relationships with funders. We have our country offices that entrench power. We don't disperse much of the grants, the money that we receive. It's a lot of implementation. And if we do give money out, it's with lots of strings attached. So it doesn't feel like we are willing to let go of power. So obviously there's a lot of conversation around the shifting the power movement or shift the power movement. But this maintenance of power, I think we have to confront, to what extent are we, in the way that we do our work, just entrenching power with us and with our systems and our structures and our decision making. The second one I found difficult to hear, because the critique was that we are willfully ignorant of the kind of attitudes that we hold. So we want, I've spent my whole career in this sector. I joined this sector because I care deeply about communities, deeply care about solidarity, and I'm sure everyone on this call does too. And so it's hard when you hear that, we're willfully ignorant of the kind of attitudes that we hold. But actually, that's what we heard time and time again. By the way, this isn't the first time we've heard this. The consultations that we've held over 5 years with over close to 1,000 participants have said the same thing. We pretend like we don't know the problem of our own attitudes. And this, as someone says, ultimately reinforces the narrative, which basically says that aid and salvation comes from outside, from the West or westernized folks. So willful ignorance. A lot of people said, as I mentioned to you earlier, the failure of imagination. We can't imagine that there could be a world in which things happen without us. So we have this sense that the global North needs to continue to exert this dominant role in the sector in order to continue to save lives. Now, of course, that's been challenged. It's been challenged before. I mean, during COVID, when INGOs couldn't travel, the work continued. Now, when there's these huge cuts, some of the work will continue. one participant in the consultation said, local actors know best, and they should be heard and respected. They don't need to be rescued by international superheroes. So this understanding that we have, or this lack of imagination, sorry, that is a real problem in terms of how we talk about power. Then, because we feel as Global North organisations that we are still invaluable. And the last one was around our own capacity. There's a lot of talk in the sector, as you know, about capacity building, and there's been lots of critiques about even using the term capacity building. That came out in our first report. Um, Actually, they switched, the participants from the Global South switched the kind of a framing of this and said, actually, you Global North folks lack capacity to talk about power. You don't know how to do it. You don't have the experience. You have no idea how to do that. And I think they're absolutely right. I don't know how to have that conversation with our partners. I feel uncomfortable talking about that because it's just, you want to believe that you're acting absolutely in solidarity with your partners. And when you talk about power, you have to acknowledge that solidarity is difficult, and equitable partnerships is difficult when there's such an imbalance of power. So we have to learn a new set of skills, particularly those in the global north. So having identified the problem, we then looked at, well, what do you want? What does equitable partnerships actually look like to you? So the first thing that we asked was we asked all the participants, there was about 200 participants, what are the values that matter most? Now, there were lots of values that came up, and I'll show those to you shortly. But I was trying to capture as elegantly as possible a one line that explained what partnership values were. And this is from one of the participants. It's a trusted, collaborative process in which actors with a shared vision and shared goals journey together in humility, openness, transparency, inclusiveness, and equity towards meeting their shared goals. Now, it's a long sentence, but it covers, I think, so much of what was said in our consultation, and actually so much of what we've heard going forward. So we then did a bit of a survey and analysis of the different words that were used across all of the different contributions that the consultation participants made. And it was clear that there were four main values that kept coming up time and time again. So those four values are not going to be of any surprise to you. They're probably embedded in our mission statements. They're probably in the pledge somewhere, right? Or some of them at least. So the first one was trust. They feel that it has to be about trust, and they don't believe that trust is there right now. They talked about humility, humility and courage needed by all of us. They talked about respect, and they talked about mutuality and reciprocity. They used those words interchangeably. Now, the thing about those, when I looked at those, when we finished this analysis, we thought, well, no one would dispute those values. But what we found striking when we thought about those four values was that what they were basically saying is those four values don't exist right now in most partnerships. If you go back to the earlier slides and we talk about the dysfunctions, what they're saying is if we're looking for a world in which actually partnerships are based on those four, those are currently not there. And that may be because of the way in which our practices and our bureaucracy prevent us demonstrating trust. It could be about the way in which we communicate that doesn't show humility. So there were, different ways in which our values show up in our relationships with our partners. It's not just about how we give the money. It's not just about how we design programs. It's about the communication. It's about the how we resolve disputes. It's about how we identify roles and responsibilities. But I think it was really fascinating that these are like the bedrock. What someone said was they're sort of foundational. So what we took then was we looked at all of this information. It was 120 pages of transcripts of all this rich information, and what started to emerge was a metaphor of a house. Some people even talked about foundations of a house. If we want a good partnership, think about a partnership, the house being that metaphor for a really solid partnership. And the first thing they said to us was, you can't build a house on no foundations or shaky foundations. So the foundations are your mindsets and worldviews. And they kept saying to us, you've got to make sure that your mindsets and worldviews are different. If you try to build the house on the existing mindsets and worldviews, which say that, you know, the global north is the sort of the holder of all the expertise, your partnership can't work. So they really impressed upon us, it's got to start with that, the foundations. Then they had the four walls of the house, being the four values: trust, humility, respect, and mutuality and reciprocity. And the mortar that sort of binds the brick, the walls together and the bricks together is the communication. So how we talk about our partners and to our partners, and the language that we use is the first manifestation of the values. So they were saying, you know, if you're talking about how those values show up, the first way they experience it is through our communication. So we've got to think about how we communicate differently. And then finally, they have the roof tiles, the sort of the practical expressions of a partnership. What's really interesting about those, and we'll talk about those in a minute, is that the practical expressions of a partnership are things like, well, let me, I can move on to it now. Um, Things like this: roles, responsibilities, program design, funding, budgeting, accountability, reporting. We all know these, and there's plenty of others. I think what we heard though was that with our partnerships, most INGOs, most organizations jump straight to these areas. And what we were told very candidly by the participants was, you don't build a house starting with the roof. You start with the foundations. So don't start your partnership conversations by talking about program design or funding, because that's the external the final manifestation of the partnership. Start with the basics. So I'll just go back to that slide. Start with the mindsets, worldviews. Start about how you communicate with people, and the trust and humility and all those sort of facets that matter. And then you can get to these things. But we, and I guess in the global north particularly, we rush into talking about budgeting and funding and reporting and monitoring and evaluation and all those things, which we're not denying are important. But why start there? Why start with the roof tiles? I'd challenge anyone to try and build a house with roof tiles first. I'd love to see. I'll ask the builders next door if they could try. Um, so that's what we heard. We then asked the participants to think about, well, what do you recommend to us? What does this actually look like? And they gave us the most enormous list of recommendations. So what we tried to do is sort of summarize them. I'm only going to give you a taster of them because the report that we wrote has a lot in there, and it is quite intimidating because there's so much to work on. And I'm sure many of you are already working on these, and I'm sure the pledge has, you know, I know the pledge community is committed to these. I've chosen just a few areas. There are plenty of others. So just to explain the recommendations and the structure of the recommendations, in every set of recommendations, there are Global South recommendations, so those specifically for the Global South partner, and then there are those specifically for Global North partner, and then there are those recommendations at the bottom that we are being told we should do together. So with mindsets and worldviews, Global South actors said to themselves and to each other, they said, we've got to allocate time to share alternative narratives that challenge this kind of discourse about what development is and how our societies have developed. And we have to, as Global South actors, critically reflect on neocolonial attitudes, because actually what was really interesting was that particularly country office staff, so Global South country office staff of INGOs said, we've internalized some of this. We've drunk the Kool-Aid, and we actually see our own communities as lacking experience or lacking expertise, and that's part of the system that we've sort of been brought into. So those are the recommendations from the Global South. For the Global South, for the Global North, we've got to educate ourselves. They said, don't expect people to educate you. You've just got to do it yourself. Do the hard work yourself. Analyze your own privilege and your own positionality. Think about how and analyze how your own organization has made mistakes in the past, as well as the sector. And also where we might have been resistant to change, because we've been quite, I think, hostile at times to the idea that we've done harm. So we've got to do some work on our mindsets. And then together, they said we should have conversations together. Global North and Global South partners having a facilitated conversation about how we understand concepts like development. Because actually, do we even share the same understanding of some of these concepts? So that's about the mindsets and worldviews. So now I'm going to jump to some practical expressions. So some of the tiles, the roof tiles. So roles and responsibilities. So for the Global South, they said, use approaches like appreciative inquiry to look at your own organizational strengths and assets rather than the gaps. Don't start with your gaps, because that's what the whole sector has been programmed for you to think, about how the gaps that need to be filled. We'll start with your strengths and assets, and then use that to be propositional to your partners, to your Global North partners. Because then you can say, look, this is what we bring to the table. These are the expertise that we have. This is what we want to strengthen, rather than these are the gaps I have. Can you help? For the Global North, there's questions around, are you working yourself towards a point where you're not necessary anymore? How many times do we ask ourselves that question? I mean, it's forced on us right now because of the cuts, because of the absolute chaos. But actually, we should have been asking this question every year for the last 75 years. Unlearning assumptions about who holds technical expertise and having open and honest conversations about the role that we hope to play. And I look back at even Peace Direct in the early years, we didn't ask what role we would play. We assumed a role. And actually our partners assumed a role. So we slip into these roles, and actually we should be much more open about the roles that we would play, and also the roles that might shift over time, because they do. So have that conversation with your partner about the roles and responsibilities and how they might shift over time. I've only got a few more slides and then we can open it up to questions. Program design. So they talked a lot about program design being really flawed, fundamentally flawed, still being very much driven by ideas that come from the Global North. By the way, they were very clear. They said, we don't reject ideas from the Global North. We want to learn. We want to learn from you. They kept saying that time and time again. They said, we want your solidarity, but we don't want it to be an imposition. And at the moment, it feels a bit like an imposition. So how can Global North actors really step back, decenter themselves, and allow Global South organizations to kind of really lead the program design? For Global North actors, they said, you've got to change your risk profile. You are risk averse, and that's partly because you get money from really bad donors who aren't very risk tolerant. So they asked us as Global North organizations to do two things. One, change our risk profile so that we actually write out what our risk profile is and how much risk we're willing to take, but also to push our back donors to accept greater levels of risk. The civil society is in real trouble right now. Civic space is shrinking and it's really hard for civil society to do its job. We need to be able to provide more space and freedom and flexibility for those local organizations to do their work and adapt. So we can only do that if we change our risk profile. They asked this very politely, but they said, be aware that changes to program design that we propose may be interpreted as instructions, which some partners may find hard to challenge. It goes back to that question of communication. We don't know how we come across, and we also don't know how some of our language might be landing in terms of that power imbalance. They said, just remember that every time you recommend something to us, it might come across as instructions rather than a recommendation, because we see you as the Global North holder of the power. For Global South, they said, assert the importance of Indigenous knowledge generation. Don't deny the sort of knowledge that you have within your own communities. It sounds obvious, but actually it's really, really hard to do, because the production and consumption of knowledge has been sort of dominated by Global North think tanks and Global North NGOs. There's very, very little still, by the way, very, very little investment in local knowledge generation and knowledge production. So we've got to change that. And Global South organizations are saying to themselves, we've got to assert the value of our knowledge rather than just assume it doesn't count. They said that we as Global South organizations should be building in inception phases so that we can stress test some of the things that we're thinking we want to do, rather than being locked into some terrible log frame that forces us to do things and we can't change it. And also they said, practice. So this was them saying it to themselves, practice the skill of disagreeing, because they don't know how to disagree with us. They don't know how to do that because they don't want to lose our funding. And I say our funding, Global North organizations. So practice the art of disagreeing. And they said, finally, review project documentation together, because if you just send it to us, we feel it's like an instruction and that we've just got to sign off on it. So they said, please, review project documentation together. I think I've got just two more to go, and then we can close. Budgeting is an obvious one. So, they said, please, for Global North, please build in costs that strengthen the partnership. Don't do it all remotely. Come and see us. Come and talk to us. Have dinner with us. Sit round the table with us. Understand our struggles. They also said that the Global North doesn't build enough staff time to foster meaningful partnerships. So lots of project officers in Global North INGOs are managing too many partners. And that means that they don't have good quality relationships because they don't have the time. They asked for institutional strengthening budget lines, and they talked about the power. They said recognize how budget discussions are an obvious manifestation of Global North control over their partners. So every single time we talk about the budget, be aware that it could be interpreted as an instruction that they can't dispute or disagree with. For Global South, they said we've got to start moving away from projectized funding, even if that's all we're getting right now. So develop a long-term vision and a long-term budget, even if you're not going to get that money, because it shows that we are thinking that way. And we should be propositional about building in costs that strengthen the partnership, as well as asserting claims to overheads, with a lot of work being done on indirect cost recovery and sharing indirect cost recovery. But Global South have to be assertive at that, because Global South was saying we shouldn't be waiting to just receive whatever we get. We should be really assertive and saying this is what we deserve. And again, review the final budget together before it's signed off. The funding is very similar, so I'll just go through this quite quickly. It said, we have to analyze how the funding has created dependency. So how can we move away from that sort of dependency mindset? Both Global North and Global South, we need to figure out how to provide unrestricted funding. We've heard that 1,000 times. I'm sure you've all heard that. We've got to stop being gatekeepers. So they said, you have funders. Why don't you let us talk to them? Why are the Global North actors still the gatekeepers? We should start with an assumption that we can provide multi-year funding. And we should also explore models that strengthen the ecosystem, not just do individual grants to individual organizations. How can the ecosystem of civil society actors be strengthened? And, Global South, they said, we've got to also look at our own communities as sources of capital and resources. It might not be funding, but it might be, person power, people power, the sweat equity, as they would say, right? So how can we as Global South organizations identify different types of contribution? And they said that we should share these updates on our fundraising efforts together, so we can better understand the challenges and opportunities. So, for example, something that Peace Direct does is that we report to our partners. We used to do it every quarter. I'm not sure if we do it every quarter now, but that's not about a particular project, but we report on what we're trying to do for them in space, whether it's advocacy, whether it's fundraising, because actually, at the moment, it's the other way around, right? So far, we talk about Global South actors reporting to us because we have given them some funding. And then the final one is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We've got to scrap our monitoring and evaluation learning approaches, consider alternative forms of reporting. Why do we still think that a narrative report is the most useful way of reporting? And Global South actors said that they've got to create different processes that are centered on the communities rather than the local organization deciding what impact is. What do the communities say is impact? And we talk a lot at Peace Direct about co-creating and a learning agenda. So we have with each of our partners a set of learning questions that we've developed with our partners. Outside of project outputs, anything like that, we have a learning agenda and a set of learning questions. And we have learning exchanges with our partner every year, which is outside of and disconnected from project work. Because again, the projectized way of working has really distorted what partnerships really mean. So we try to have learning exchanges where we just reflect on what's happening in the relationship, what's happening in their context, what's happening in our context. Thank you for bearing with me. I know that was a long presentation, but I hope that was useful, and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, your reflections, and your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dylan. Really fascinating. And I've read this report, but I feel like I've learned a lot listening to you again. Just before opening it up to others, I wanted to accept the invitation to talk about power, because I think it's an important one that was offered. And so to acknowledge that my power in a facilitation role in this session, that happens in virtual rooms as in real rooms. But also to notice, I did a quick head count, the numbers are changing a little bit, but I think we've got about 12 people on the call who would identify as working for organisations rooted in the South, and about 25 people working for organisations who would consider themselves the international part of the system. Within those, I think the terms of global north and global south are really dispersed because people who work in different parts of the system identify as coming from different parts of the system. So I work for a global south organization, but I have a number of identities that contribute to my power in that system, including my whiteness, including my language, my passport. Language has been discussed in the chat, and the dominance of English and French. I have 2 colonial languages under my belt, which is helpful. But I'm also heartened by the fact that in the pledge community, as increasingly and often happens, despite the structural barriers to togetherness, that we are creating a space in which that togetherness that your report and your presentation encourage is possible. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. The last thing I wanted to say was just to zoom in on the point you made about the maintenance of power, because I think that is so critical, as you said, in this moment where resources are becoming more scarce and people are nervous about their programs, their jobs, their positions in the system. And I think that real attention to awareness of maintaining power is critical for our community. And I'm going to drop in the chat the work that the Equitable Partnerships Working Group have done that touches on this. But yes, would love to hear from everyone else. Gard, did you want to jump in first? You have your hand up. Over to you, Nishant.
Hello, Kate and Dylan. Did an excellent presentation. First of all, good evening from the Eastern Hemisphere. My name is Nishant Joshi. I'm from the organization called Humanitarian Aid International. And a lot of the things that you said during your presentation and in this study specifically resonated a lot with what we have worked in the past year. Most of the last year, 2024, for me was spent in organizing this global study on the status of humanitarian frontline workers. And apart from advocating for an equitable space and a safe space for the indigenous frontline workers to work for, we also touched a lot upon the decolonization of the aid architecture and shifting the power. And one thing that I particularly agreed with you upon is the power of how you communicate the ideas and ideologies between the North and South. Like, for example, even the positive sounding and benevolent sounding ideas like localization or empowerment could invariably have somewhat negative connotations. Because when do you empower somebody? It's when you feel that they do not have power to begin with. Uh, why would you localize somebody who has always been local? So we are trying to shift the narrative a little bit and come up with words like relocalization, which maybe would have a different ring to your ear than localization. Like you're taking back the onus of the word and putting more indigenous stress into it. Uh, we are trying to focus more on challenging the top-down hierarchical structure of knowledge transfer as well, where we often feel like Western knowledge is superior and indigenous local knowledge is inferior. So there is a need in the humanitarian architecture where there's an equitable platform, not just for actors who perform in the humanitarian sector, but also thought leadership on the local level, where indigenous knowledge can also be utilized to find solutions across the world, not just within the local context. But I would have to slightly disagree with you on one caveat, a small point that you had made earlier, but that Western actors need to step back and let the indigenous communities take full control of their operations. I feel like there's the kind of siloed approach that we are trying to avoid in the global architecture. I think we all need to work together. And there is still a lot that indigenous actors have to learn from INGOs and the global north. But at the same time, there has to be a balance of an exchange of learning space. And once again, thank you so much for this lovely presentation.
Thank you, Kate. Shall I respond, or do you want to take a couple of questions? How do you want to do it?
I was going to ask you the same question. Up to you. I think Nishant's given us loads to
Yeah.
think about, so maybe respond to that, and then
I
we'll
was
keep
going
the
to say
conversation.
I might forget otherwise
Yeah.
if we take too many questions. Nishant, thank you. I thought that was excellent, and I think the point that you make about the language, it is so easily overlooked because we then rush to practice as well. It's again, we rush to the tiles of the roof, and actually the language and the communication that we use is so important. And I just want to reinforce that point about the two dimensions of the language, one of which is the terms that we use. So being very, very mindful of the terms that we use, as you say, and you were absolutely spot on in that. And also then whose knowledge matters and where that's coming from. And I think that, it would be really interesting if all the Global North organizations on this call were to do an audit of the knowledge that they produce. Where does it come from? How much of it is actually generated from the partners, or how much of it is extracted by the Global North to put into a nice Global North report? We actually recognize that problem in our reports. We did the same, so we are guilty of that too. But what we're trying to do is now look at our, work with our partners so that they produce their knowledge in their own format, and we support it. So I think that those two dimensions of language are really, really important. The point where you disagreed, and I'm very happy for disagreement and dissent. It's all good. I think we actually don't disagree. I think what we heard from our participants around the world was they want to learn from Global North. They want to learn from others in the Global South. We all want to learn. We are all committed to learning. As a Global North organization, Peace Direct is committed to learning. I think what they said was stepping back doesn't mean stepping away. So they don't want us to airbrush ourselves out of existence. They do want to learn. They do want our solidarity, but they want us to show up in a different way. So that's different from saying we're disappearing. It's actually saying show up differently. And and by the way, I just wanted to also respond to the point that I think it's Kamal Iqbal has said around the global north, global south. I mean, those terms are problematic. We absolutely understand that those terms are problematic. There have been efforts to try and figure out different types of terminology. So that's the language issue again. And it's quite interesting that the whole sector, both global north, global south, all of us struggle a little bit. So we're trying to figure out the right language. And when INGOs often they ask me, well, what language should we use? I mean, I don't have the answer. We should be asking our own partners what language they feel comfortable with and what they don't feel comfortable with. They might feel quite embarrassed or humiliated by some of the terms that we use, and we won't even know because unless we ask them, they wouldn't tell us. Thanks.
Thanks, Dylan. Garth, are you able to come in? And then there's some great chat going on with Kamar and Rawati as well. So welcome you to speak to that if you'd like to. Go ahead, Garth.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Dylan, for this wonderful presentation. In fact, Dylan, I felt, although you apologized at the end of the presentation for having taken long, I was like, I didn't want to hear you say I am done with the presentation. I actually wanted to continue hearing more and more. And with that, I want to thank you so much for this research. Also, thanks Kate and colleagues for organizing this session. It's been very, 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 very good. I think we should use part of it to engage on the different commitments, such as the C4C commitments, the grant bargain commitments, because when you raise the issue of multi-year funding, I realize that idea it's bringing out its evidence. It's a square furthering evidence regarding the non-compliance in that regard. Now I have two or three issues. One is on the findings. You realize that I think almost 90 or something percent, if I'm not mistaken, of the findings, you fall to the global north. And I was thinking that probably if you could, do you find at some point where we had some issues regarding the global south? Because I don't think that global south is as clean as it is. I saw something around accountability and something, but also believe that probably maybe you could have bumped into some conceptions or misconceptions around the global south. And given the fact that I work with World Voices Uganda and also host the Western Uganda Humanitarian Platform and also the piloting the Emergency Response Fund facilitator, the pool fund mechanism, that would be very helpful for us to improve. The second issue is on the issue of trust. I totally agree with you. And I think I could also even add something if there's space, that I think the issue of trust has been hampered by misconceptions. And I think I've seen different partnerships that have been hampered by misconceptions around the partner. And I think the Global North has that challenge of misconceptions around the Global South partners in terms of trust, and if somebody is laying it will take some time to trust that actually what they are talking about is true, even actually, and actually trust is a very big factor in negotiations around the budgeting. That's why you find, for example, the budget they are talking about. You find imbalances in regard to salaries. You have different scale. The Global South has got its own scale. The Global North has its own scale. When the Global South organization is engaging that please our staff need to be remunerated this way, they say no, but that's too much. Then you wonder yet actually you're consuming the same things. Issues around program cost versus admin cost. And then maybe the other thing I just want to end with is the issue of is a question that rotates around what practical solutions do you do you think can be exploited to achieve most of the partnerships are projectized instead of programmatized. So, and that's a very, 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 very big issue. And but also you also know that in most of democracies, you find when they have change of governments every 5 years. So, and ideally you cannot be sure whether the program that you are working on is going to survive the next wave of a new government. So I'm thinking that that would be a very big issue. And the very lastly is the issue of accountability. It also seems that I think accountability is also seen from one side. And I think, I believe that in a mutual, for the purpose of reciprocity and mutuality, accountability should be seen on both sides. If you're asking me accountability on the small funds you've given me, how about you actually accounting on where the reports, my reports are going and how they're impacting on I mean, I think that's an issue that probably maybe you need to probably also highlight regarding the findings. Oh, thank you so much. This has been a very great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Gard. So I'll try and respond quickly because I know there's lots of other questions as well as some in the chat, Kate. So I might try and respond to those as well at the same time. So you asked first about the issues from the Global South partner. We didn't ask those questions actually because the critique, the framing of the consultation was, what are the problems between the Global North and the Global South, and why are they not equitable right now? But that was the majority of the participants were from the Global South. And we didn't really ask them to analyze their own partnership practices, more their experiences of partnership practices from their Global North partners. It's a really good question. To what extent are the practices of Global South actors also contributing to the problem? But I would say that the recommendations did cover that. So the recommendations are split between, recommendations for Global South practitioners and recommendations for Global North. And there are lots of recommendations for Global South practitioners. And that demonstrates that there is a lot of work to be done on that side so that we, as Global South actors, can be better, can be more assertive. So I would recommend you have a look at that. The issue of trust goes back to the first consultation that we held in 2020. And, one of the participants, more than one of the participants said, the current assumption is that we are guilty until proven innocent. That's how it works right now. We are guilty until proven innocent. So we are all assumed to be at risk of fraud. We are all assumed to be not capable of managing money, rather than the other way around. And it's obviously we all know it's manifestly unfair because there's financial irregularities in every country. And yet we disproportionately focus on certain countries or certain people, and so they were very, very critical of that, very consistently over the last 4 years. I think the only way of dealing with that is to tackle our own mindsets, because I think that yes, there is going to be fraud in whichever country you are coming from. Uganda, there'll be fraud in Uganda. There'll be fraud in my town in London, right? There's fraud everywhere. So I think that we over exaggerate fraud in some places, and absolutely I think that there's a real problem of the mindsets. We have this inbuilt risk aversion, which is not based on, I think, reality and scale. I mean, the example I give, there was a famous financier, some of you may remember, called Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff was from the US and he defrauded US investors of $50 billion. Now, that's the kind of scale of fraud you get in some countries, $50 billion. That was a white man in New York stealing people's money. And yet we are paralyzed with fear about sending money to small Global South organizations where we might be giving $5,000. So I think if we just look, a bit more clear, with a clear mind about these things, actually, and based on trust, hopefully these things will start to be easier in terms of partnerships. Um, I your internet cut out around the practical solutions. I'm afraid your screen froze. So it'd be helpful if you could tell me what you wanted. What what did you want us to talk about in terms of practical solutions?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear from you about the practical solution regarding the how we could the practical solution that can be explored to achieve material funding, because I think it's
Oh,
becoming it's becoming a little bit problematic. I think it's a
yeah.
commitment. I don't think that it's a commitment that can easily be achieved. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, look, there's no easy answer. The problem is inbuilt into the system, right? Right now, it's projectized short-term funding, and I want to just refer back to what's been said in the chat. Helen has said, does the issue of timescale come up? Are there partnerships that are more likely to be equitable if they're longer? I mean, the reality is we didn't talk about timescales at the consultation. However, they did say that you absolutely have to do away with the idea that partnerships can be 6-month projects. The idea that you set up a partnership agreement for a 6-month project is laughable. So they knew what was not going to create equitable partnerships, but they didn't say actually it needs to be 3 years or 5 years. I think all of us would agree you can't really build equitable partnerships overnight, and you certainly can't do it very, very quickly. It takes about it's a relationship, it's a relational thing. Ultimately, what they kept coming back to was it's about human relationships and it's a relational thing. And we have stripped the relational aspects out of partnership and it's become a contracting thing. So how do we reinsert the kind of humanity and relational aspect in, and then just say that, how do you build a relationship with anyone? You don't do it quickly. What was interesting about the consultation was that some of the participants said, do you know what? If you global north actors don't want a partnership, a genuine, meaningful partnership, and you actually just want someone to implement something for 6 months, just be honest. Tell us that. Don't dress it up and call it a partnership. We are not stupid. And actually, some of the global south partners said, you know what? We're fine with that. We still want your money. We still want to implement. We don't mind if we just become a subcontractor, as long as it's clear that that's what you want. So I found that really interesting because I assumed that naively that global south actors all want just long-term equitable partnerships, but some said, you know what, if the money you give us helps us deliver our objective and it's short term, that's fine, but don't dress it up and pretend it's something that it's not. Just say this is what it is, these are the limitations, it's short term, we can't develop any long-term partnership with you, but the money might be useful to advance your mission, and keep it like that. So I thought that was really frank and honest. Let's be a little bit honest about what is and what isn't a partnership. To answer your question, Gard, about the time, the multi-year funding, the thing that I've been really interested in and curious about is that, particularly for INGOs, we are not very good at advocating and pushing our own donors to do that. Actually, the responsibility does lie with those who are dispersing the grants for us, as INGOs, to actually push the donors to be better. Now, some INGOs are just afraid to do that because they want to demonstrate that they can comply with the rules and regulations set down by donors. We've actually refused donor funding because we think it's poor quality funding, and we said we can't do that to our partners. And we've written long, lengthy critiques to our donors, these donors, and said how bad their funding is. And we have refused to accept it. Now, INGOs have to do that because what they do is they accept poor quality funding. And what do you do when you accept poor quality funding? You give out poor quality funding. So we have to be better at, pushing back. But the final thing to say is that what we've identified, we're doing some research now on flexible funding mechanisms for local actors, is that INGOs sometimes receive quality funding and turn it into poor quality funding because they have their own rules and regulations. But when they actually go back to what the donor asked, the donor didn't ask for that. So sometimes actually the INGOs make it worse because they've got their own internal systems, structures and processes and internal audit. So we've also got to challenge ourselves to sort of undo some of that stuff. Most of the problem does sit with donors because we know that they're risk averse, but not always. Sometimes it's the INGO that causes the problem. So internally changing the agenda within our organizations and pushing back to donors. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks, Gard, for all those thoughts. Just connecting those to the Pledge for Change also has an influencing working group. We have a couple of people from that group on this call, and their focus is both the internal influencing around how do we get these pledges taken up and done, and then also how do we influence individually and collectively the big donors, exactly to Dylan and your point. So that's another nice point of intersection. Bakir is next, and then Sarah, and then we also have some more great questions in the chat that we'll try and get to. Over to you, Bakir.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Dylan. Hello, everyone. Bakir from Asylum Access. It's been a very insightful session, and just so you know, we have also been working on equitable partnership. We've put out a position paper, and right now I'm working on a toolkit to facilitate the building of equitable partnership. And some of the presentation that I heard today, it's been quite thought-provoking for me. And I had a couple of questions. One was, it was interesting that came out in your findings that it's important for both partners to define what partnership means, so it doesn't go to that subcontracting mindset. But then when I was hearing about the key values, and we also have key values or elements of equitable partnership in our position paper, but it made me thinking whether do we need to define these values as well? Like, for example, trust. What does trust mean? Because trust for someone who is living in the US is totally different thing than someone who is living in Afghanistan, because I'm from Afghanistan, just FYI, is a different thing. Like, do we need to define that as well? What is humility? What is respect? Do we need to draw some parameters around that? So that's one question. And second question is, I was curious to hear what you think about the identity in partnership, because for me, I see partnership as, so when partnership happens, that partnership happens between people and between organizations, and people bring their individual identity and they also bring their organizational identity. And what is the role of identity into these? For example, I am someone from Afghanistan. I have lived experience, but I work with a global North organization. When I go to a partnership with a local organization, I bring my understanding of lived experiences and thoughtfulness and consideration, put that into the partnership, but also at the same time, the expertise of the global North organization that I bring with me. And how does that, according to you and your experience, how does that affect positively or negatively the partnership setting? And this is a big question that we are right now thinking and reflecting internally at Asylum Access as well. Like, we're thinking like, okay, we have people with lived experiences in our organization. We have people on the board. We have people on executive levels. We have people on the lower level. But then, do we still define? Should we still define ourselves as the INGO? Should we define ourselves as an organization with lived experience? Or is this something in the middle? If there's something in the middle, what is that? And also, like, do we really want to define that? Or like, what kind of negative impacts is that going to bring to us? Like, do you want to put a level to that? So all of these like different questions that come to mind. I mean, I don't have answers to all of this, but I'm just curious, like, to hear what you think based on the experience that you have had. So that would be all. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bakir. That's a great question. So the two questions, the first is, do we have to define the values? 100%, absolutely. We can't assume that everyone shares the same understanding of any term. And so fundamentally, that's where it starts. Mindsets, worldviews, the language that we use, all of that. Let's make no assumptions. And so if you're writing a position paper, start with the basics, defining those. The second question is more difficult to answer, but I would say that what we heard and what we've heard through all these consultations, going back to that point that partnerships are relational exercise, they're relational things, and therefore that the relationship that they have with the person in the organization matters. Sometimes you'll have a relationship, the partner will have a relationship with one person and that matters to them. So the values that person holds, that identity of that person matters to the partner. The problem is that you can't rely on that, because then what you have subcultures within an organization which are then contingent on the identities of each individual person. And you can then have a problem where one partner is treated brilliantly because that person that they're relating to has a particular mindset, value set, etc. And next door they have the opposite. Now, very, very interestingly, a piece of work that we're doing right now on what we call the donor scorecard, which is really trying to understand the behaviors of donors in relation to their commitments to local organizations. We've been doing this research now for 2 years. One of the feedback that we've had from governments and donors is that within a government, departments have different identities and they will act differently. So you'll have one department that is super progressive and has a brilliant set of values about flexibility and adaptability, whilst another will be completely in the wrong century. So actually there are these subcultures. So the answer to the question, I suppose, for me at least, is we can't rely on the partnership being mediated and managed through individual the value set of the individual. The values have to be embedded in the organization and have to then be transmitted throughout the whole organization. Otherwise, the inconsistency is a problem. And then you get the worst case of contradictions and, people feeling grossly unfair, right? Because they are treated differently. You might then have a meeting with all the partners and some will have had a wonderful experience, some will have a terrible experience. So I guess the most important thing is, how do you create a culture in your organization where the values are understood, adopted and lived and checked throughout? So we, for example, at Peace Direct are trying to figure out how our values are monitored through our one-to-ones with our staff, through our performance objectives, so that actually it's not just about objectives of doing stuff, but it's also about the objectives around being. Like, who are you? How are you living those values? Because then you can be comfortable that your organization, if you leave asylum access, that whoever takes your place is going to look after and be a brilliant partner to your partners. So that's the most important thing for me. I think before we go to other questions, Kate, I'm just going to whiz through and just make sure that we've covered some of the ones on the text. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine. I also going to use my facilitation power to notice that one of the way that power shows up is in gender. And so far we haven't heard from any women colleagues on the call. So I'd love to hear Sarah's voice, then to have the questions, and also to invite other women who'd like to share to just put your hands up.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. So it's Sarah. I work with IRC and partnerships, and I'm based in Beirut. Very lovely talk. Really, really like it. Thank you for inviting us. So I think one part of the question you've touched based upon it, Dylan, now, when we talk about the barriers, we talk about donors as well. My concern is that when we talk about donors, it's Western states. And when we say Western states, so the barrier are political in the choice, like we've seen now, like we've seen the funding in Gaza, like we've seen the funding even during the war here in Lebanon. We've received very little compared to what the war had its toll on humanitarian needs. So do we have, as the eighth sector, even the power to change this? Because I feel, yes, we can do all the other things, but this is super essential. and the fight is still somehow political. But related to that, even I work, yes, with an INGO, but I feel sometimes that INGOs also are like, yes, placed in the West. And like you were saying in the presentation, there's this oblivion of power. We don't believe in a word that exists without us. So consciously, why would the leadership of this organization would want to make a change if they don't want a word that doesn't exist without them? So, and it is, I do see that as many Western states, right? Like they reflect more or less, if we look at it, the same dynamic and the same approach. I don't want to be pessimistic. The presentation has been super inspiring, but these are just concerns that come to mind and to feel like, what can we really do? Over.
Thanks, Sarah. Look, on that last point, I mean, I speak a lot to chief executives of INGOs and donors, and the reality is, as you say, I think that most INGO strategies are predicated on the assumption that INGOs need to be bigger and need to grow and do more. For decades, that's been the case. And in fact, the critique in our first consultation was, why is it that INGOs think that their strategies have to be about doing more and being bigger? Because if they do, they're squashing us. they're, and that's the reality. Now, I've given this various presentations to some of the biggest INGOs, and almost all of them have said that is the fundamental challenge that they face, is that their board or the senior leadership still are locked into a mindset which is the only way we can demonstrate that we are successful is by growing. There's no conceptualization of success that equates to shrinking. Shrinking is seen as failure. So we've got to radically do, well, there's two things we need to do. We need to radically rethink what we understand to be success. And one of them is to actually shrink as organizations. I would say that about IRC and any of the big multi-mandate INGOs, because actually until we do that, we won't be able to then, the space is taken up by us. And actually, the money, as I talked about that research, the OECD research, so much of it is going to INGOs. That doesn't mean it leaves a vacuum. What it does is it then provides space and a platform for other organizations to fill it. Now, if you're cynical, you would say, well, if IRC doesn't do it, someone else, another big multi-mandate INGO will come in and step in. So there is a question around whether or not, INGOs together can actually make a commitment to all shrink and invest the money in strengthening local civil society. But what I've noticed, and I've been talking about this now for 5 years, is that almost all conversations are to be taking place at the mid-level within organizations. They're sort of junior to mid-level. They're not taking place at the chief executive level, and none of them are taking place at the board level. So the board are completely oblivious to this. Every single board, I imagine IRC's board are not, other than, of course, the catastrophic cuts that have just happened right now, but they wouldn't have been talking about shrinking voluntarily. So there is a gap right now, which is that we've got some fantastic thinkers at the sort of junior and mid-level within all organizations being really thoughtful. I imagine, Kate, that's the same with the pledge community. The question is how you get the sort of senior leadership thinking about this, and not thinking about this because suddenly they're forced to think about this because of the cuts. I mean, right now, every organization is thinking about this because they have no choice. But then the cuts aren't, it's not coming from the right place in terms of thinking about what success looks like. It's coming from a kind of financial imperative. Oh my God, we've got to cut 50% of our workforce because the USAID has just disappeared. That's not the right framing. I mean, it might lead to a similar outcome, but we really want to be able to have those conversations thoughtfully about what's the role that INGO should play. And it's something that I will talk about at the next presentation. So to be honest, Sarah, the reality is I don't know how we do that, because part of our advocacy, Peace Direct's advocacy efforts, and Degan's advocacy efforts, and the pledge is to talk to senior leadership and boards. But it's really hard. I've noticed that it's sort of unreconstructed. They sort of function the same way they have done for many years. So yes, more to do. And the thing about the funding, I mean, just to say, and I know some people have asked this in the chat, is if if INGOs take a step back and local organizations have a direct relationship with donors, won't we just repeat the same problems? Yes, unless we advocate to those donors. So we all have a responsibility to change donor practice. And what's interesting is there are two commitments, at least two commitments that we could use. I mean, we could also use the grand bargain, but I was thinking of the donor statement on supporting locally led development, which specifically and explicitly talks about shifting and sharing power. And there's a recommendation from the OECD called the OECD Recommendation on Enabling Civil Society. And that talks about shifting power. And that has been signed up by every DAC OECD donor. We can actually go to governments and we can go to foundations and say, look what has been signed up to by most of the world's richest donors, and use that as a way of changing their practice. So that does mean more advocacy, because then when the funds start to flow directly to local organizations, then at least those local organizations won't be crippled by due diligence and compliance and subcontracting sort of relationships. If it all shifted overnight, a lot of organizations in the global south would be crippled by the ridiculous amounts of bureaucracy that are imposed on by donors. So we do have a responsibility to change the donor practice. Kate, I'm aware that we've only got 5 minutes left, and I haven't answered some of those questions in the chat. So I'm wondering, what would it be helpful to respond to those now or at another time? How would you want to do it?
I think I'm a great fan of giving people 2 minutes in between meetings if we can. So I was going to suggest that we wrap up, that we take these questions and between us, Dylan, between our teams, promise to respond to as many of them as we can. That's part of our learning agenda. We may not be able to do that super fast. So if there's something really pressing, please ping us directly. But I think it would be good to get these back. If that works with you, Dylan.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'd be very happy to respond.
I just want to share something.
Yeah. Go
on. Just one piece of perhaps good news or optimism for the group, because everyone who is on this call is part of an organisation that has signed up to our shared vision, and the signatories, the INGOs, have signed up precisely to a number of commitments, including one that says we will not operate in places where local and national civil society is able to do that. So shrinking, although it's not articulated as such, is built into the pledge by design. And the accountability and learning mechanism that we're now in the final stages of the first round is really helping us to start to track that. So a good news story from yesterday, we started our global dialogue series. We have 6 extraordinary thought leaders from the global south who have analysed all of the data that's come in from and about the signatories, and are doing dialogues with leadership teams from the signatory organisations. So we're getting to that CEO, C-suite level group. And the one that we spoke to yesterday said we must take this to our international board in our next meeting. So some of that effort to take all of this extraordinary wisdom and practice from groups like these, but also to use them to influence up, is happening. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, for the really great conversation. Thank you so much, Dylan, for being so generous with your time and for the work that you're leading. And I hope everyone can go and get a cup of tea or stretch your legs before you jump into your next thing.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks everyone.
Kate. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.